There was nobody there, and Leonard Bernstein walks in and sits down. He's the only one in the whole auditorium. I was only really, really grateful that I had worn rubber underwear that day. Because it was just...
That opening clip, of course, is the subject of today's episode, Gary Karr, the wonderful Gary Karr. I love Gary Karr. He's the reason I played bass. He might very well probably actually be the reason you played bass, and just what a titanic figure in the bass world, how revolutionary he has been for our instrument, and that moment which he was describing right there of playing for Leonard Bernstein and then eventually playing on TV for this incredibly large audience really changed the game for bass. So this is from my first conversation with Gary that I had in person. I'd been hoping to have him on the podcast for forever, and it finally happened in 2017. And then it happened again in 2018. I got a chance to visit him at his home with Harmon Lewis, and it was wonderful. Both those episodes are linked up, but today we're going to be hearing many, many, many people who have spent time with Gary Karr, are associated with Gary Karr, have great stories from Gary Karr, and we'll start off with Gary Karr himself. Quick shout out before we do that to our sponsors for today's episode: D'Addario Strings, Steve Swan String Bass, Upton Bass, The Bass Violin Shop, Modacity, A440 Violin Shop, and Colstein Music. More on them in a bit, but let's hear the rest of that clip from Gary Karr.
I was a student in Aspen, Colorado. I had, I think might have been my first summer there, and that was in '61.
Okay.
Or maybe it was my second year in '62. Gosh, I'm terrible on dates.
Yeah,
but anyhow, it had to be '61. So I'm in Aspen '61 in summer, and Jenny Turrell was a wonderful faculty member there who was an incredible mezzo-soprano, had a huge following in New York, sang with Ahmed at one time, but was a really, really close friend of Leonard Bernstein. So she came to a student recital, and in the student recital, I don't remember what it was I played, but I played this piece, and afterwards I got a message from her inviting me to dinner. You can imagine, she was like a god, and to be invited to dinner to Jenny Turrell, and it said, P.S., please bring your bass. So I brought the bass along, and then she had a whole bunch of Russian pieces, and I come from a Russian background, and so she put on the piano, and she said, let's do some things together. And so she sang some tunes, and then I read, a bass part obligato from the piano part, and I just played along with her. We ended up recording together and performing an awful lot together, some really wonderful performances that I could tell you. I'm sidetracking. So anyhow, so we became friends, and and this was all in this one summer. She goes back to New York and calls Bernstein, and she said, "You've got to hear this guy. It's something so unique. No one has ever done this before, and you've got to see what this is all about." And he said, "Okay, tell him to come to Carnegie Hall on whatever day." And I showed up at Carnegie Hall. I had to go on the stage. They let me in. I unpacked my bass. There was nobody there, and Leonard Bernstein walks in and sits down. He's the only one in the whole auditorium. I was only really, really grateful that I had worn rubber underwear that day. Because it was just...
Next, we have a clip from David Murray about his early experiences working with Gary Karr.
So anyway, Chalmers contacted Gary because Gary had shown some interest, I guess, in working, doing general music ed in the classroom. He wanted to work with kids. And at the time, he was living in New Jersey. He was teaching at Yale and New England and Juilliard and all these places. And I remember Gary saying at the time he kind of didn't like the resistance he was getting from some of these college basses. Gary is such a different player than so many people, especially back then. And a lot of people were resisting. They said, "Oh, you can't do that on the bass. You shouldn't do that. You don't want to play like that." And he kind of didn't like that resistance. So when he got this offer to come to Nova Scotia, which is kind of isolated, and just work with kids, he jumped on the offer, and he was already touring a little bit. So he did that for a couple of years. And then he stayed around Halifax for a while. He was teaching at the university there, Dalhousie. Mm-hmm. And so when I started, Gary came into one of our bass classes, and I remember that day was, everybody was sitting outside. We had classes like over lunch period. So I came to the class one day and had my lunch, and my mom had dropped off my bass earlier or something. And everybody was sitting outside. I went, "What's everybody doing out there?" And they're like, "Gary Karr's in the room." And we were like, "Oh my gosh." And everybody knew who Gary was. So we went in, and, we were all really shy, and he was just, being wonderful. And so I got to meet him then, and he came to a couple more classes. And then finally I had just, taken to bass playing like a fish to water. So I went through a couple of upper classes. I just kept jumping up through all the different levels. And they were like, "Well, we've done everything we can with you. You've got to go talk to Mr. Karr. Maybe you come work with one of his students." And so I went to him and I said, "Could I study with one of your students?" And he said, "Oh, I'll take you." And I was like, "Okay."
Oh, wow.
And kind of not knowing what that meant. And so I think I was 15. I forget what fall that would have been. I can't do the math, and I don't want to do the math.
Right.
But it was early 70s sometime. And so I went to him, and we started private lessons. Well, he was traveling quite a bit, so I usually had about a half-hour lesson once a month or so. And then sometimes I'd go by, and his students would be doing the, exercise routines, what we call vomit and all those other exercises and stuff. And I'd hang out with that. But that was like the most incredible concentrated half hour every month. And I just took that and soaked it up like a sponge. So when I went off to college, that was his first year teaching at Hearse. Mm-hmm. So I continued, my undergrad studies with him at the Hearse School in Connecticut. So, but having Gary, as your private teacher from 15,
not bad.
Pretty amazing.
I was surprised to learn that Gary Karr lives part of the year in Las Vegas, but not too long after my conversation with the next clip guest, Derek Jones, I got a chance to visit Gary in Las Vegas. So here's Derek about him discovering that Gary lived in Las Vegas and some experiences with him.
Gary lives here. Him and Harmon live here half of the year now. And I got to meet him at just a fluke. My friend said, "Hey, Gary Karr's performing at the Flamingo Library." I was like, What?
What?
What? And it's a free concert. I was like, what? You got to be kidding me. And there's a wonderful youth program in Las Vegas to get young people to play string instruments. Hal Weller started the program. I can't think of the name of it right now. But Hal and Gary are really good friends. And it's a great story. So I said, man, we have to go. It's like, so we drive down to Flamingo Library. And all these libraries in Las Vegas are really interesting. They have these beautiful performance halls that are just really great, and you wouldn't even know it. And then you'd walk into this one room, and all of a sudden it leads down a hallway, and then there's this really 500 seat theater or something like that. And they're very underutilized. But anyway, this was when the Bernstein letters came out, or Bernstein, the book, Leonard Bernstein's, all his letters, they had this at the Smithsonian. They made it, his daughter made it into a book. And, Gary and that family were really close. And so his daughter was here talking about the book and doing a lecture on it for anybody who wanted to come. So we got there, and all of a sudden here's Gary and Harmon walk out. And I sit there in the audience. I look at my friend John Coleman. And I go, I can't believe this is happening, man. Because I wasn't performing as much anymore, and I never got a chance to see him play. And then he starts playing. I'm like, wow. And then they show a video of him playing on the radio show that Leonard Bernstein had in the 50s or late 40s. He was 18, and they showed the video of him playing the Swan, I think, or something like that. And, I'm just sitting there going, I can't believe this, man. This is so wonderful. And then they sat down and talked about the book and his life with the family and anecdotes about their lives and stuff. And it was just like sitting like a fly on the wall, right? It was really cool. And then when they're done, we come out, and everybody's in line to meet him. And I said, man, we got to get in line. Just got to say, I can't believe it, So we get in line, and line comes up, and then Hal Weller walks up, and he's a friend of my friend John. And John introduces me and says, Derek's the bass player on the Cirque du Soleil show KÀ. And Hal goes, oh my gosh, we all went to see the show last night. Gary and Harmon and Mrs. Bernstein, all of us went. And he goes, I have to introduce you. So he just takes me out of line, and we walk up to Gary, and It's just like, wow, and Gary's like, oh, we loved the show. I loved it's such a beautiful show. And then we started talking, and then he goes, we were talking about his bass. He had the travel one that he had with him. And he goes, you want to check out the bass? And I went, are you kidding me? so we all went back on the stage, and another gentleman was there with some of his students, and Gary just hands me his bass, and I just start playing. I was thinking, I can't believe this is happening. And then we just kind of became friends and kept in touch, and I go over and hang out with him.
A question I like to ask people on the podcast is, what advice would they give their 18-year-old self? And here's Barry Kolstein of Kolstein and Sons answering that very question.
I think as an 18-year-old and, or even in my early 20s coming into the shop, everything like that, a lot of it was laid out for me. There was a plan, that I was given a plan, which I often say I've done a good job, and I'm proud of what I've done with the shop, and I continue to be proud. But, I was given an opportunity, and I always respect self-made people, that weren't given that opportunity. It's what you do with the opportunity.
Barry has been providing bassists with opportunities through beautiful instruments, bows, cases, you name it. He's been doing this himself for 50 years, and the shop is celebrating their 70th year in business. Thank you so much for what you do, Barry. Check them out at Kolstein.com, and thank you for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. And there's a lot that goes into being a bass player beyond that initial purchase of a bass. We need bass bows, we need bass covers, we need stands, we need new strings, pickups, wheels, quivers, upgraded gear like tuning machines, end pins, repair parts, all of that. And when someone's looking for some new bass gear or to upgrade something on their bass, I send them to Steve's shop. He's located just south of San Francisco in the Bay Area, and he is the largest dealer in basses between Los Angeles and Canada. That is a big distance, folks. Learn more at steveswanstringbass.com. And thank you so much, Steve, for sponsoring the podcast. So many people that went on to have thriving teaching and performing careers worked with Gary Karr and had such wonderful experiences with him. Here is Diana Gannett, who ended up becoming his teaching assistant, teaching partner also. And here's Diana on the story.
I was just finishing college, and I got accepted as the first bass major at Yale. And they asked me who I wanted for a teacher. And I said, well, either Gary Karr or Stuart Sankey. And at that time, Sankey moved to Austin, I think. And they got Gary Karr. And I was like, okay. Yeah.
Wow. So what was that? I know it's such a broad topic, but any just takeaways of that experience of first studying with Gary Karr, and maybe just a little bit about what he was like as a teacher, what that experience was like, meeting him and working with him?
Well, he was still very young, the wonder kid, and just a fabulous player. I remember seeing his debut on TV with the Bernstein. Remember the Young People's Guide or whatever those things were? And it was magical to me seeing him play. And at that time, I was 14, and I said, I'm going to study with him someday. And I did. So, yes, he was kind of scary and pretty demanding. I remember I spent that whole first semester on a C major scale. He wanted me to do it right. These teachers. And that was good because I learned a lot. Yeah, so he spent a lot of time with me that he didn't spend with the subsequent students because I was the first one. He was such a natural player, too. And sometimes when I wasn't quite getting what he wanted, I would just hand him the bass and say, play it for me. And that was a great way for me to learn from him because I was very good at learning that way. Also, he was very ahead of his time. So many things that he did pedagogically were a good 10 years ahead of what everybody else was doing. He was just a very evolved player, and it was a delight working with him. I really enjoyed it.
Hector Tirado from Puerto Rico is deaf but plays bass, which seems so remarkable. And Gary worked with Hector over the years and is a huge influence on Hector. And here is Hector on this story.
A long story, Jason, but when I was a kid, he came to Puerto Rico 4 times. But the first two times, he came every 2 years. So the first year, I couldn't play for him. So I knew him by recording. So I say, someday I will play for him. So the first two, after four year, he came again. I couldn't play for him because I was so young. So 6 years later, I say, okay, I'm ready to play for him. So I went to the hotel. I have a meeting, and he said yes. Yeah, I said, Mr. Karr, can I play for you? I went to the hotel and I learned the bass, from the conservatory. I didn't have a bass, so I played Reverie for him. And right after that, he wrote me a letter recommendation to study with him at Yale. But I had to wait 1 year. So from there, after a year, I went to Yale to make my master's degree. And then every summer at GISA and Victoria, every other summer. And I have a lot of things to, good remembrance,
So let's go back to that Karr TV debut for a moment. Here is Lawrence Hurst in my conversation with John Grillo about just the massive impact that appearance had.
About the significance of when Gary Karr was on TV for the first time.
Oh yeah. Well, when you consider that, I think it was 1961 or 62 when Gary really hit the world stage. He was, I think he was 19 when he did this, and he played the Swan at pitch with the New York Philharmonic in what they call the Young Artist Series or something like that. Anyhow, I did see that Saturday afternoon. I think it was live. I can't remember if it was a video. They called it Kinescope at the time, if it was, but I think it was live. And it was just jaw-dropping to see a bass player get up and play like that. It was so in tune, and it was so musical, and it was better than most cellists can play it. And what really was astounding was that he played, at that time, he played for more people in that one shot, in that 10-minute segment, than all the other solo bass players in the world had ever played for collectively up to that time.
Wow. Gary's influence is felt all over the world, and especially in Australia. Here is Phoebe Russell, principal bass of the Queensland Symphony, and then directly followed by Steve Reeves, who just retired from the Melbourne Symphony, on their experiences working with Gary Karr.
Yeah, so the first CD I ever bought was called The London Double Bass Sound when I was, 11, 12 maybe, and Gary was headlining that, and I used to put it on repeat at home and listen to him playing, all the great hits, I guess. And I absolutely fell in love with him. I think he radiates so much joy for what he does. And I went first to his Karr camp when I was 15. I think I just turned 15. Yeah, and my mom had to come with me because I don't think they'd had, many 15-year-olds there before. But yeah, and I got to have a lesson with him, I guess 3 lessons a week, and we did technique class. Actually, perhaps that's where my love of technique stems from. We had technique class every morning with Gary, and then we did, bass quartet concerts and bass orchestra concerts. But the thing that amazed me the most was he did recitals every weekend for us at his house. And I don't think I've ever seen another bass player perform with so much energy, like just as a person. He has so much love for the instrument and so much love for what he does, and I think that's something you can only see live. You can only understand why Gary Karr fans are so excited about him when you've seen him play live. Yeah.
I'd arranged to go to Holland and study with Anthony, but on my way I went to Victoria, BC, and spent 6 weeks with Gary. Changed my life. Completely changed my life.
So I've had Gary on the podcast a couple times.
Yeah.
About a year ago, I had the good fortune to spend a week with Gary and just kind of hang out with Gary. He was at Andres Martin's camp, who we just saw last night. Yeah. So, and he's changed. I mean, like so many bass players, the reason I play bass is because I saw Gary play in my hometown live. So, but maybe what was that experience like working with Gary? What was Karr camp like?
Oh, look, it was transformative.
Gary Karr, of course, also started the organization that became the International Society of Bassists. Here's a conversation I had with Jeff Bradetich many years ago about Gary's role in that process.
Oh, absolutely. I think that organization witnessed just really remarkable growth during your time as the director there. I think you probably, do you hold the longest tenure as director with that organization?
Well, just so people understand, the history of the organization is not totally clear, I think, especially to the younger generation. Mm-hmm. But Gary Karr started an organization called the International Institute for String Bass and published a number of journals, which were mainly his own writings, and really got some things started. But unfortunately, as things do, and especially as he got really busy as a soloist, the organization ended and just went defunct. And then a couple years later, Barry Green kind of generated interest in the bass and an organization for bass, and he was a young up-and-coming artist himself, and so he started the International Society of Bassists. Mm-hmm. And he ran the organization for 8 years, and then I took it over from him, and I ran it for 8 years, and maybe there's something about 8 years. At the end of that, we both had, we run the course.
Keeping track of what you practice is so critical. And my practice companion, Modacity, it does it for me. It's so awesome. Here's Modacity founder and CEO Mark Gelfo on how this works.
Accounting before the spreadsheet was manually handwritten ledgers, and that's where most musicians have been for the last 200 years. And it's time to automate that and save some time and let people focus on what's really important, which is performing on their instrument.
And that is exactly what Modacity has done for me. I feel so much more focused and energized and enthusiastic about practicing. I love this app so much. You can learn more at modacity.co and visit our website for a special offer for lifetime access for this app. Such a cool piece of technology. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Modacity. This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. What happens if strings aren't quite the right size for your instrument? For instance, if you play a 5/8 bass, when strings are slightly too large for an instrument, the tension will be lower. And when strings are slightly too high for an instrument, the tension will be higher. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Do you need to play a bass beforehand that you purchase? Here's Gary Upton of Upton Bass on that topic.
I hear these kind of truisms stated by retailers like, you have to play the bass that you're going to buy. I think that's the worst thing you can say. Because
great if you live in New York City.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's it.
or have 10 grand you can spend on traveling. Right? But sometimes you have to trust people, right? And sometimes you have to trust someone's reputation, sending out those videos, and I can hear it and I can feel it, and I trust this company's not going anywhere, and da-da-da-da-da-da. That's what I tried, right, Eric? I really drilled home. I said, for a long time, like, give them more pictures.
Yeah.
Give them the videos.
Give them everything they need to make a decision.
The reputation of Upton Bass is stellar. People know, like, and trust them through all the great content they've put out online and through time and time again delivering on their promise of quality and consistency no matter what level of bass you're purchasing. Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Though Gary is known for the Karr Kusevitsky bass that he played for most of his career, what is affectionately known as the Amati bass, there is a bass maker that had a huge impact on Gary. Jim Ham, relates the story of how he got to know Gary. And by the way, Jim's so humble that I don't think he explicitly said this, but he made the bass for Gary that Gary absolutely loves. He plays that bass for every single thing he does. He makes sure that anywhere he plays, there's a Jim Ham bass in that town, and it's just remarkable. I've seen it in person, and it is pretty cool.
I was familiar with Gary Karr even before I moved to Victoria because I'd seen him on CBC television. Mm-hmm. At that time, Gary was teaching in the Nova Scotia school system. Mm-hmm. And he did a special, the CBC did a TV show on him with Gary doing sort of a combination of talk and recital, and I had seen that on TV. and I just was totally blown away, as anybody at that time who ever saw Gary Karr would have been. And just, how could you ever forget that? And so I got to Victoria and I saw a poster that there was a Gary Karr concert, and thought, that's that guy I saw on TV. He's here in town. Oh, I'm going to that. And I did, but would I ever approach him? No. I mean, I'm not going anywhere near that guy. That's like, I want to go see God. No. But while I was working with Francis, Francis said, well, why don't you go and talk to Gary? And he comes to Victoria, and so I sort of worked up my courage in 79, in 79. Went to a concert that he did in conjunction with the Johansson International Music Festival, which was a wonderful thing that we had going on for many years at that time, and Gary was a principal part of that. And I sort of buttonholed him after a concert and introduced myself and said that I was a friend of Francis Rutherford, and Francis said I should meet you, and Gary's eyes just lit up, and he said, Francis Rutherford, well, if you've been working with Francis, please come see me. And by the way, I've been having some trouble with my bass, which was the Kuzovitsky bass at that time. And long story short, the next day, Gary's bass is on my workbench, and I think, oh, God, now what am I going to do? But I was able to solve some problems that he'd had for a long time with some mysterious buzzes. Pretty soon, well, if you know one bass player, pretty soon you know 100 bass players.
Right.
And after I met Gary and started working for him, I was getting a lot of basses coming in. Plus, there were some really great musicians with great instruments who were coming to that music camp. And those musicians and their instruments were coming into my shop all the time then. And that was going on for years. Some really great stuff. And bows. And so I got more and more into it. So Gary had everything to do with my career in sort of violin and bow work, and not only with basses.
Ranaan Meyer from Time for Three and a multiple podcast guest here was massively influenced by Gary Karr too. And here's a conversation from Ranaan and John Grillo and myself from way back in the day, I think 2007, about Gary Karr.
You always talked about how great of an experience you had at that Gary Karr camp. Did you go to a summer camp with him?
Yeah, we had. I did a.
You always bring. It's just interesting because that seemed to be such an influential kind of week or two that you had there, and.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I had this one. Well, I had so many great moments with Gary Karr. Just working with him and everything. Constantly was about the music for sure. But there was this one thing that happened. I remember he was driving me to this one of the clinics, and he told me that I should be a soloist. And I laughed and said, okay, how am I going to do that? And he said, I have no idea.
Well, Ranaan certainly figured it out, and thanks to Gary for suggesting it and having the vision, of course. Now, Larry Hutchinson, who recently retired from the Detroit Symphony, shares stories of James Clute, who I studied with for a bit back in Minneapolis, about how circumstances led to Gary Karr actually being at Larry's recitals.
Because of his relationship with Gary Karr, studied with Gary. And I was one of those, but Clute would get orchestra parts from the Minnesota Orchestra, and and we would go through all of the Beethoven symphonies and Brahms and all of that, and and he'd give us bowings and talk about that stuff, and then the combination. Gary would come up. He was at the University of Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's right.
At the time, and he would come up to the Twin Cities. Usually about once a month, and so that's my connection with Karr, and this went on for actually a couple of years. I'm proud to say Gary Karr was at my junior recital and my senior recital.
That is so cool. We'll wrap up today's episode with this thoughtful excerpt from my interview with James Oesi about Gary Karr and how he worked with him over the years, and how James's style changed, and just how his working relationship with Gary Karr changed over the years, and how he continued to be an influence, but how that role altered as he continued to develop as an artist.
It's interesting because my experience of it was very, at first, it was very bizarre. It was very surreal. I had, and I feel like, because there's two things. There's firstly, and there's this sort of, you're meeting an idol, at least for me, because he was really, I was not, growing up, he was a bass player I actually discovered rather late, which sounds shocking. But that, in a weird way, made the impact of him even bigger, because it was like, I had listened to so many bass CDs, and, at the time, a lot of them I was extremely disappointed with. And there were some that really stood out that I was like, oh, wow, this sounds really great. This sounds really great. I remember Duncan McTeer's recordings and Joel Corrington's at the time. I was like, oh, wow, this is really great. And then I found a Gary Karr recording. And for me, it just blew everything else out of the water. And ever since, I have been like, wow, this is incredible. This is really on another level of communication, like what you just said, and connecting with the audience and the listener. And so I remember when I went to Karr camp, and also, I grew up in South Africa, which is so far away from everything, and you really feel like that. So meeting anybody, any musician that you really admire is a really big thing. And I remember the first day of Karr camp, and he walked into the room and we're all there, and I almost just started applauding. I'm glad I didn't, because I would have been alone. But because it was just like so surreal that like, I was like, wow, this person, who means so much, who's done so much for all of us bassists, he's just there, and it's weird. I find that's a weird thing about sort of famous people, is that at a certain point through their notoriety, they become kind of more than a person, which is, whilst they are just people. So it's, it's a very tricky sort of thing. So the beginning was, it was a bit surreal for me. And on the other hand, my opinion did change, thank goodness. In the very beginning, because of course and actually this was the beauty of Karr camp, was that there was no audition. It was for whomever just loved to play the bass. So we're really there with people such as myself who played quite a while, and were very serious. Let's put it that way. And then, everybody was serious, but I was really, a serious little teenager. And there were people who were professionals who had been playing, who had a job for years. And then there were also people who had been playing for 6 months. And I remember, and this is again getting back to this sort of cynical 19-year-old. I remember being so skeptical about that, because I thought, I'm sorry, but that's all very lovely that that somebody who's been playing for 6 months, loves the bass and wants to come here. But what realistically are they going to get out of this? And so I remember in the very beginning being kind of sort of looking on with this sort of dual perspective of, wanting to soak everything up, but also being a bit skeptical. And it was interesting because at a certain point, I did realize, and it happened early, luckily, that actually the way he taught was indeed beneficial to all of us, actually. It was beneficial to, the person who was learning to play a scale, and to the person who was, who was tackling whatever difficult concerto. And that was quite impressive. And it was, I don't know, it was, so like on the playing perspective, it was, I don't know, it was very interesting because it was also a little bit like the sort of learning all the, not the tricks, but kind of, like how he produces sound. He just taught us that. And you're like, oh, okay. Oh, that's it. I mean, and of course that, it's not that it's that simple, but it felt like a lot of mystery was solved for me at least. And I must say he is very, I mean, I love him and I think he's incredible and I think there's nobody like him, but I do find it interesting that I find it tough to talk about his teaching because he plays in such a specific way, and I feel like there's a lot to be had from how he plays. But on the other hand, I don't want to sound like a clone. You know what I mean? And I don't. And so it was. I came completely converted. At the end, playing everything close to the bridge. And vibrato and, full on. And it's funny because I had sort of last year I had a bit of a full circle moment where I spent 10 days with him and Harmony in Las Vegas with my pianist and we had lessons. And it was very intense because we had a lesson every day. And it was really interesting because I feel like in these last, 9, nearly 10 years, my playing has developed a lot, luckily, thank goodness. And I feel like when I came out of car camp, I was playing, my bass was super upright. Everything was close to the bridge. And because you also have this sense when you go there, you don't want to lose the magic, because you feel like you've gotten this stardust and it works, you suddenly everybody, the bass, you can hear it. And there's no, like all these things that Gary Karr is famous for, suddenly you kind of have an insight into how they work. And so you want to play everything like that. And I feel like that's how I came out of car camp, all those years ago. And since like I said, my playing has developed. And so when I went to him last year, it was really interesting because I felt like it was much more of, okay, well, and he was great and he was tough, I must say. He cracked the whip, which was great. But there was also a sense of, okay, I want to take that stardust, and if we're going to call it that, and see how I can improve things that I believe in already, musically with it, which is kind of how I approached it, and I'm so glad I did.
That's going to do it for today's episode and for this 2020 series here in March of 8 highlight episodes. I don't think I've ever done 8 in a row, but I like to look back. I think it's a useful exercise for the show, for the development of the show, just to think about what we've been putting out to synthesize material for who knows what, some future project. I don't know. I am totally loopy at this point because I have been doing this for 9 hours straight just to get up and go to the bathroom and run to Trader Joe's. But I learned so much putting these together. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode with Gary Karr, all the other ones we've done. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you are a first-time listener, somehow miraculously you found this episode and got here and are listening to me tell you this stuff, then welcome. Thank you so much. We've got a lot in the archives, approaching 700 episodes in the podcast well over a decade, millions and millions of downloads. So welcome to this community. You can learn everything about this show at contrabassconversations.com, but I'm probably not speaking to someone who's brand new to the show. You've probably been listening for a while, I love hearing from people. Reach out, get on the email list. If you're not on the email list, that has grown and grown and grown into the thousands, well into the thousands at this point. And we are always trying new things here at Contrabass Conversations for the podcast and other projects. And there's a lot in store here in 2020. So thank you for being on this journey with me. Thank you to Krista Copper for making these 8 episodes happen with your cataloging and archiving. I'm so thankful for that and for these ideas for topics. It just makes this possible. I don't think I would ever do these if I didn't have that help, because it's just too much work. And thank you to the rest of the team, Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. Mitch Mooring makes award-winning basses just east of Dallas, Texas. MitchMooring.com will take you there. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.